peace, love, and understanding is our motto here, and don't want personal negative attacks or anything like that. If you're watching here on two-way, thank you for joining. Love to get you involved. And as always, we like new people to talk. So if you've not been part of this, please raise your hand if you'd like to comment or ask a question. We're going to talk about a range of topics tonight. I'm going to run through what's going on. I have a couple great guests with us to talk about Florida and about the economy. And then again, we want your participation. So if you'd like to be part of the conversation, raise your hand. And if you're chatting here on Zoom, on the two-way platform, as always, again, personal negative attacks are not welcome. Learning is very welcome. So if you have questions, you can ask them there, or better yet, raise your hand and come on in and ask. Lots going on. And as I said, to me, like I could tell you for an hour, the full hour, everything I know that's going on, both in front of the cameras and behind the scenes. But I'll be brief, but I do want to show you some stuff. The dominant story of the day, both in news and in politics, is Hurricane Milton and its approach to Florida. This is a topic of great focus for President Biden, for former President Trump, or Vice President Harris, all of them active on that today, particularly at the White House, where we've now heard twice from President Biden speaking about storm preparations, warning people to evacuate, talking about coordination with state and local officials. And on both occasions, he engaged in about the sharpest criticism of President Trump I've heard him do in an official context. He did it during the campaign when he was the nominee and the presumptive nominee, but you'll see the second round of that. It's quite striking. There was an event done at the White House that was a multimedia event with President Biden at the White House, Vice President Harris in New York, FEMA director, other people on monitors, a briefing, and it was very highly produced in the way it was done, and meant to provide information to the people, particularly of Florida. We're going to look at a little bit of that. The president and the vice president are coordinating. They know the election's coming up soon. So the first thing I want to show you is the way Vice President Harris was given a role, which, again, outside the context of the campaign, she would not have been. But watch the way President Biden made some remarks and then basically in television parlance threw to Vice President Harris, who was in a different city. Roll number one, please.
The support that they need as quickly as possible. Already, we have sent more than 1,000 federal personnel to be on the ground in Florida to assist with what needs to happen in the state to prepare for this hurricane, and we will continue to scale up those efforts. To the people of Florida, and in particular, the people of the Tampa region, we urge you to take this storm seriously. As has been said before, this is a storm that is expected to be of historic proportion. And many of you, I know, are tough, and you've ridden out these hurricanes before. This one's going to be different. And so we ask you that by every measure, understand it's going to be more dangerous, more deadly, and more catastrophic. So please listen to
as I said, we started the
officials.
clip in the slightly wrong place, but it started with the president finishing his remarks and throwing to her. It was a very informative briefing. It was a lot like the Cuomo briefings during COVID, with people on screens, people in person, lots of information. A couple things happened during the briefing that have gotten attention. One of which was President Biden's very sharp words for President Trump. I'm going to show you his second take in that in just a moment. But there was a moment where it appeared that the vice president was being coached by her staff or fed by her staff questions. That's a lot on red media today. But the other thing that happened that's gotten a lot of attention, I just want to show it to you for historical sake, was President Biden made a remark with a historical antecedent. Roll number two, please.
Focused, and we are ready to support the people of Florida.
Dan, you're doing a hell of a job. You always have.
Again, I want to thank you all and Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. The FEMA director's working 24.
All right, so telling your FEMA director they're doing a heck of a or hell of a job during a storm, not necessarily the best thing to do. As I said, the briefing was very well produced for the most part, pretty dramatic. A little while ago, President Biden came back out in the White House by himself, and once again updated people in the storm. Talked about coordination with the vice president. Talked about coordination with Governor of Florida and others. He took questions at the end, but he also, both on his own and in the Q&A, went very hard at Donald Trump by name. I'll show you a little bit of that. Number 3, please.
Former President Trump has led this onslaught of lies. Assertions have been made that property is being confiscated. That's simply not true. They're saying people impacted by these storms will receive $750 in cash and no more. That is simply not true either. They're saying that money needed for these crises are being diverted to migrants. What the heck are they talking about? Stop it. It's outrageous. It's just not true. Now,
He went on to call him un-American in the Q&A. Very, very stern President Biden. Now, the vice president is off campaigning, but after she finished that big group briefing, she did 2 phoners. She did one with CNN, with Dana Bash, and she did one with the Weather Channel. And so she is all in on the symbolism of being part of this effort, and it's going to have to stay with it, although she did go campaign. All right. They also did a call with Bibi together. Not a great readout on that yet, but again, they made a point of including her in the call, which they did before she was the nominee often. But they made a point of making sure people understood that. Also, New York Times is reporting that Kamala Harris has raised $1 billion since she became the nominee. Kind of incredible. And she'll keep raising more in this last 4 weeks, but incredible. What was Donald Trump doing besides continuing to criticize, often using falsehoods, the rhetoric of, or the storm reaction? There was a release of a video podcast that he did with comedian Andrew Schultz. Andrew Schultz, I've met him, brilliant guy. This is an extremely long podcast. And so the press yesterday spent a lot of time covering Kamala Harris's The View and Stern and Colbert. I don't think, because they're probably not as familiar with Andrew Schultz and because it's Trump, I don't think this will get as much attention. If you want to see the humanization attempt of Trump with a very bro-y podcast, I recommend you watch the thing. I'm a fan of Andrew Schultz, so I enjoyed watching him interact with Trump. But I want to show you a little bit of it. And again, there's lots of moments that are both purposely and not purposely funny. But this is Donald Trump with Andrew Schultz and his posse. Number 4, please.
Think I'm the number 1 influence?
I think it's
So who else?
Rogan. I think it's Rogan, you, and Kim Kardashian. Like, Kim Kardashian influences the shape of women's bodies and faces. Like, you see so many, they're literal shape of human beings.
Do they want to look like her?
They want to look like her. So once we start seeing dudes want to look like you,
Yeah.
and I see young Jack over there, I think he's trying to do it.
Yeah.
Jack.
Your TikTok guy.
TikTok Jack.
TikTok
TikTok
Jack.
Jack. So tell me, you know, this is a little new world. I call him, his name is Jack. I call him TikTok Jack. I'm good with names, you know.
You are.
You're very good at
You
that.
are.
I mean, Pocahontas.
Yeah.
We have names.
What about, and there was, Tampon Tim was good. What about,
Tim,
is
the
that?
problem with Tampon Tim, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
In other words,
It's a mouthful.
it's a lot.
Yeah.
Tampon. And you can't stutter it through when you call it. It's really a lousy word to say.
Yeah.
But it's quite accurate, right? there are some, like Comrade Kamala. It's a little hard to say. She's comrade because she's obviously a communist.
Yeah.
She's horrible. So I call her comrade.
Yeah.
And it's not bad. But when you put the names together, it's a little, you got to be able to pume. No, you got to be able to put it out there.
All right.
But we
You
have
get
a
the
lot
point.
of good ones.
It's very bro-y. Most of it's very bro-y. There's parts that they're not. He talks about they talk about fatherhood, whatever. But I'm just pointing out that Trump is doing a lot of these too. Some of you may know Andrew Schultz from, he was in the Tom Brady roast. That's probably one of the more higher profile things. A hugely successful comedian. Again, that's going on. Now, a few more things. Polling. Okay. I said something about polling yesterday, both on the morning meeting and here, about what I'm hearing from Democrats and Republicans. And there's a branch of the Democratic Party that I would say can't handle the truth. I've made it clear Harris can still win. Where the polls are now don't necessarily represent where things will end up. Trump has a lot of problems. Her turnout operation is far superior to his. Abortion rights could surge voters to the polls. There's all sorts of reasons. But the snapshot of where we are now is there are a lot of really worried Democrats. And there are really no worried Republicans, including in Mar-a-Lago. They're very confident about where things stand. And you can go on my Twitter feed and see some of the back and forth. I would say to these people is, I'm not rooting for Trump or saying he's going to win, but I am telling you that Democrats, including people who are polling, for instance, for Democratic Senate candidates in states that are battleground states, they're really worried. There are people working for Kamala Harris who are really worried. And that's putting that out in the open is reporting, but it's also something that if you want Harris to win, that's better than doing what the Clinton people did in 2016. Pretend it's not happening. Okay, so that's a criticism people make of me, that when I find out what the private polling, which again is every private poll better than every public poll? No. But the private polling that's good, because the pollsters who I trust, because I understand their reputation, their methodology, their credibility, it's not spinning me. Democratic pollsters are not trying to spin me. And I don't think the Republican ones are either. Okay? There's people who think this entire hour every night should be a catalog of the outrages of January 6th and Donald Trump's latest lies and errors. People are welcome to bring that up, and I don't mind talking about it. But that's not an interesting show to me to talk about that every night for an hour. Okay. What I'm talking about now is the state of the race. Quinnipiac out with 3 new battleground state polls, public polls. Some people are not fans of Quinnipiac. Let's show that, please. That's number 5. Okay. This is not exactly what I believe the private polling shows, but Pennsylvania, Harris up 3, Michigan, Trump up 3, Wisconsin, Trump up 2. Now, I can tell you without fear of contradiction that there's not a Democratic pollster, including people working for the Harris campaign, who would say that Pennsylvania is Harris up 3. And what they would all say is it's her worst of the blue wall states. Okay. So here's some public polling. You're welcome to read all the public polls you want. I tend to not credit the public polling that much because it's often not correct, because the public polls done by media organizations and by academic groups, they're not as robust. Okay. So I want to show you something that suggests that I'm not the only reporter who's hearing from Democrats who are worried. This is CNN, Dana Bash, who has now had 2 interviews with Kamala Harris. She's not hostile to Kamala Harris, I'll say that. And her colleague talking about how worried Democrats are. Number 6, please.
We have some new CNN reporting today about what is going on behind the scenes inside the Harris campaign and more broadly among Democrats who are growing more and more anxious about a 2016 redux. CNN's Priscilla Alvarez joins me now. Priscilla, we were just joking here at the table that anxious Democrats happen on a day that ends in Y, but this is something that perhaps is warranted given the data that they're seeing. Explain your great reporting.
Yeah, look, that's exactly right, Dana. And this has been a campaign that was described by multiple Democrats, allies, aides, to the vice president as a good vibes campaign. But what's also creeping in now is that anxiety. The reason for that is because these polls are not really moving. Despite multiple battleground blitzes, despite the opportunities she has had across media outlets, there is still not a lot of movement from voters who are moving more towards her versus former President Donald Trump. In fact, I had one source describe it to me this way, quote, people are nervous. They know the polls are tight. And a lot of us are having these flashbacks to 2016, too. We know when it can go the wrong way and it can still feel fresh. So 2016 is the key here.
Okay.
When I've talked to Harris campaign officials,
So,
it often
that's
comes
okay.
up and
You can drop out of that. So again, are they worried because they're conditioned to be worried because of 16? Yeah, that's some of it. And they're outspending Trump. She's campaigning. And they're outspending Trump. She's campaigning. She's doing this social media, new media stuff. She did her 60 Minutes interview. They want to be ahead now. And they know what their polls say. And their polls are not as good as the public polls for her. They haven't given up. I'm not writing them off by any means. Again, abortion, turnout, Trump ceiling, all could produce a Harris victory, and maybe a comfortable Harris victory. But there's concern because they see things getting in a direction. Where is it moving directionally? They don't like the direction it's moving in. That's all I'm reporting. I'm not reporting the race is over. Some people are mischaracterizing what I'm reporting. It's true again today. And what's happening is I'm hearing from Democrats who know her well, elected officials, donors, California strategists, who are saying she needs to be a warrior in these last few months. She needs to up her game. She needs to feel it. She needs to close strong. And they look at her performance on television yesterday, where it appears, as always, she's trying to not make mistakes, get through the interview without making mistakes, rather than really transforming the race and demonstrating to the undecided voters who we've talked to on this program, she'll be a good steward of a good economy, fierce commander-in-chief, ready for the job. That's what they're worried about. They're worried that they're not in a good place to win 270 electoral votes, and they're worried that what she's doing at a performance level is not good enough to win, perhaps. That's what I'm reporting. All right. Love to get folks in. There are two people we're going to call on who were nice enough to make time to join us. And we're going to talk to them and get to you. If you'd like to get in the conversation here on the two-way platform, please raise your hand. Whether you're new or not, we'd love new people as always, but if you're new in particular, we'd love to hear from you. And we want to talk about whatever you want, stuff I brought up or anything you want. We're starting, though, with Andrew Warren. Andrew is a lawyer and a prosecutor in Florida. He's running for public office, but we're going to set that aside for tonight, but I hope to have him back to talk about that. Andrew, I just want you to talk as a Floridian. You're in a hotel room in Tallahassee, Jacksonville. Where are you?
I'm actually in Gainesville, Mark. Thanks for having me tonight.
Gainesville. So tell folks just about your day. Where did you wake up? What have you done? What's the situation for you personally in dealing with the storm?
Well, like a lot of people from the Tampa Bay region, I'm waking up not in my home in Tampa. My family and I are in a mandatory evacuation zone. We left yesterday to come up to Gainesville, which is about 120 miles northeast. You know, I'm the elected state attorney, so the district attorney in Hillsborough County for the whole county there. But this is one of those storms that people are taking extremely seriously, as they should. Watching the crowded highways as people were moving north and east to get off the West Coast. Tracking the news, just, hoping and praying that Mother Nature spares us her worst over the next 24 hours.
How old are your kids?
I have two daughters. They're 13 and 10. So my wife, my girls, and my dog all made the way up from Tampa to Gainesville to try to find, safer pastures for a couple of days until we can ride out the storm.
Yeah. Is it frightening for the girls? Is it an adventure for them? How is that for them?
I don't think they totally understand the impact that we're going to face. My older daughter understands a little better, but both my kids over the past couple of weeks, just going around our neighborhood in our city and seeing the devastation that was left behind by Hurricane Helene. And that wasn't a direct hit on Tampa Bay. Other communities in Florida, took it on the chin worse than we did. But for them to see, people lose their homes, possessions piled up on the street, hear the stories of people losing their lives, it is scary things for little kids. But that's why we try to, teach them to follow the rules, right? To leave when we're told to leave, to help out our neighbors, to thank law enforcement and first responders, because they're the ones who are on the ground trying to keep everybody safe. So, we take this as a learning opportunity for our kids.
What'd you take with you, Andrew, in terms of family photos or your CD collection? Probably don't have one of those, but what'd you take with you in terms of personal stuff?
We bunkered down the house, tarps and sandbags, and tried to move as much as we could off the floor, and expecting that if there was a high storm surge, as there's predicted to be, that we lose the house potentially or lose damage to the house, but that the most important thing is protecting our health and our safety. So we traveled pretty light. We got the kids and the dog out. And then again, we're just going to pray for the best.
What do you know about your insurance policy, Andrew? Or is that something you'll look at it after the fact, or do you already know exactly what it covers?
No, we know what it covers. In Florida, so flood insurance has a maximum policy of $250,000 on a structure and $100,000 for personal property. But the problem is not so much those capped limits, which is far below the average home value in the state of Florida and in Hillsborough County, but the fact that it's something like 10% of Floridians, only 10%, have flood insurance. Now, not 100% needed, of course, but there are a lot of people who are subject who are vulnerable to these floods, who don't have insurance. We've had a very difficult, to put it diplomatically, insurance market the last few years, with insurers leaving the state, a problem that has not been addressed by the legislature. But I'll pause there because today's not the day to talk about the political problems. After the storm passes, after the water recedes, identify and assess the damage, we can talk about solving those problems. But right now, this is about a time for the community to come together, for neighbor to help neighbor, and to get through this as a community and as a state.
All right, Andrew, stay safe. I hope you have fun in the room. I hope you brought some board games with you. And we'll love to have you come back and christen you tonight, our Hurricane Milton correspondent. So come back regularly and good luck. I hope you get home soon.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. All right. Again, if you'd like to get in the conversation, love for you to raise your hands and get a chance to talk. We're going to talk to one more guest here who was nice enough to join us, Zach Karabell. Zach, welcome and thank you for joining.
My pleasure.
All right, so Zach, you are expert in all things economic. So I'd love for you to first talk about if the storm is really bad and there's a lot of destruction, is that a net negative for the economy of Florida and the country, or is all the rebuilding a positive?
I would say as an intro point, I feel like economic expertise is at best a mixed bag in that, as we see every day, and we certainly see in political life, the disconnect between economic theory, economic statistics, and lived economic reality are a series of gaps that, if not yawning, are pretty extreme. And I think all of us should probably not profess economic expertise per se, because clearly there's a lot that goes on in these things that we call an economy that befuddles our collective capacity to really make sense of it. And clearly the gap right now between statistical economic reality and lived economic reality is pretty extreme.
Yep.
As we know, one of the unfortunate, maybe even somewhat perverse realities of GDP statistics is that disasters are good for the economy. Disasters are bad for people and good for the economy. So if there is, as some people suggest, $150 billion plus damage in Florida alone from the combined effects of these two, of Helene and Milton, let alone another, however many hundreds of billions of dollars there is in North Carolina and some of Appalachia, then that will be hundreds of billions of dollars spent to rebuild roads and houses and homes and infrastructure. That will be a positive effect on GDP growth for the fourth quarter of 2024 and the first quarter of 2025. But it's not exactly what you would say is an optimal way to increase economic activity.
Without a doubt. All right, I want to ask you about the vice president. She's put out about a half dozen economic proposals over the last few weeks, including one yesterday, as all serious economic policies are, unveiled on The View, adding a benefit to Medicare for home health for the elderly. If you take her individual policies that she's proposed and you take the group in the aggregate, what does that tell you? Which ones do you think are good ideas? And what does that tell you about Kamala Harris's economic philosophy?
All right, so if I were advising the vice president, which I'm not, I would probably say lean into the care economy as a theme and hammer it home as a coherent, simple idea, meaning we have done an inadequate job as an affluent society, making it easier for families to have and raise children, to send them to school. We've made it inordinately difficult for families to care for their elderly loved ones and relatives. We've made it too costly. And, she as president is going to address these gaps in how we spend money at a state, federal, and local level. That would be a simple message. I think the laundry list of I'm going to do a $6,000 credit for homes, or maybe it's a $25,000 credit for homes and a $6,000. I mean, I have now forgotten what the exact amount is. And when you start laundry listing, you know, even the people who profess to really focus on these things, which would be you and I in this case, can start to lose the narrative thread, right? So I think they've made a, if not strategic, then certainly a tactical mistake by not just saying we are an affluent society that should do a better job making sure no one lacks basic necessities of healthcare and education for their children, and healthcare and care for their elderly, and the ability to buy a home, et cetera. And you know, let the details come with, but you know, no one's going to walk into the voting booth and go, "Oh, she promised a 25,000." They're going to go in thinking my needs are going to be attended to reasonably by an administration that's competent.
Right. So we've had this juxtaposition of Team Trump saying Joe Biden is a complete failure, and Team Biden saying he's one of the most successful presidents, not just in terms of legislation passed, but quality legislation. And there are independent analysts who rate the current economy pretty good. The Fed obviously played a role, but there seems to be a soft landing. And obviously, consumers and voters and citizens, I wouldn't say they're necessarily all closer to the Trump point of view, but they certainly haven't bought the Biden-Harris point of view in full. Is there something about the Biden record that you think, leave the politics aside, just on the economics of it, is there something like the infrastructure bill, for instance, that you think is actually truly transformative for the long-term health of the American economy?
I mean, look, there are aspects of the completely misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, which in many ways was an Inflation Creation Act, maybe for some good reason. I mean, I think we've sort of detached all of our economic and political analysis from the reality of a 2020, 2021 period where this global pandemic was upending everyone's expectations and most people's rules about what to spend and when to spend. And the United States was not alone in spending trillions of dollars to try to make sure that people were economically secure, even if they were epidemiologically at threat. And we've like elided that from the narrative. And that's a mistake. You know, these were anomalous times. It was a weird period. Hopefully it'll be the only weird period like that. But you can't look at the performance of our pricing and our economy and global supply chains and sort of just write that out of the story the way we have. This wasn't a Biden thing. This wasn't a Trump thing. You know, COVID and government reactions to it were its own thing that transcended party and transcended country. On the longer term, you know, there's a lot of spending by the Department of Energy, mostly in the form of loan guarantees for long-term businesses, for more effective energy sources that likely will amount to, if not $1 trillion, many hundreds of billions of dollars, not of spending, but of the government taking what they call first loss, meaning taking the risk capital part of it, most of which it will likely see come back to it over time. That doesn't mean there won't be a kind of Solyndra-ish, that famous episode of government spending on a company that failed. You know, that's going to happen. But I think all that will bear quite good economic fruit, but it won't do it in an election cycle, and it won't do it in an inflation cycle. And the final thing I'll say about this is public attitudes about what's going on economically lag statistical reality. So, you know, 1991, 92, by the time people went to the polls for the famous, it's the economy stupid election, the economy had already started turning around, but it took 6 to 12 months for people to feel it. And it often takes 6 to 12 months for people to feel it getting really bad too. So it lags in both directions. You know, unfortunately, if you're Kamala Harris, and fortunately, if you're Trump, people will probably start to feel pretty good about the economy, judging from these lags, sometime in the early part of 2025, when it won't make any difference for the election of November of 24. And whomever wins the election in November of 24 is likely to benefit from that, unless there's just colossal war in the Middle East, or, I mean, there are always things that could happen that could derail this kind of story. But at the moment, if you judge from past experience, statistical reality and people's experience of it have substantial lags.
Right. All right. I got one more question for Zach, and then your questions for Zach on the economy, on any things we talked about, whatever you want. Again, raise your hand, your electronic hand. Love for some new folks to be part of this. So please, everybody come in. I have heard throughout my career that if we don't deal with the debt and the deficit, America will be destroyed. Our children and grandchildren will have no life. That interest of the debt is going to take up the whole budget, with the exception of a couple Clinton years. We've run debt and deficit and haven't made progress. This is the least amount of conversation in a presidential campaign about debt and deficit there's ever been. Trump made it clear, basically, I'm not going to be the one who's stupid enough to take the pain of cutting spending, and then COVID also, but he wasn't on track to cut spending even before COVID. And Kamala Harris isn't talking about it either. So are we actually getting closer to debt and deficit ruining our economy? Because we still have the best economy in the world, or is it just a myth? And as long as people will lend us money, and as long as the bills don't come due, we can keep doing this.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have written over the past 15 or 20 years my skepticism of deficits mattering nearly as much as people think, which is not to say that there is a point at which they will matter. Clearly, there's a point at which they will matter. The point is that point so distant from where we are that it doesn't matter? And I think largely that's the reality, meaning at some level of debt, either interest payments or the ability of people to lend or the desire of people to lend will become untenable. But if that point is so distant from any lived reality, it's not really just kicking the can down the road. It is, we can sustain this level of debt. People say, well, what if interest rates soar? But the reality is we live in an inherently, if not deflationary world, in a world where capital is plentiful and dollars are desirable. And unless there is a global currency that can compete with the dollar, and for all of the dislike of the United States and for all of the rise of China and for all the, global affluence being created by a middle class that is emerging and emerging and emerging, the dollar is like the lingua franca of economic exchange. It is the way in which the world does business. And that provides huge advantages to the country that prints dollars, namely the United States. So, at some point, yes, if interest rates are 10% and we are $100 trillion in debt, it might be a problem. It will be a problem, but we're not there. And there's no necessary, we could definitely see $100 trillion of collective deficit in our lifetimes. But if that's at 2% interest rates with a $60 trillion economy, it's not the size of the debt. It's the amount that it costs to service it, the size of our overall economy. And remember, a lot of our debt we just owe ourselves. All we do at a regular basis is the government refinances its own debt to its own self, which is an accounting, not fiction, but it's not the same as a debt that needs to be paid to someone who's going, pay me my money. And I think we misconstrue that around our debt as well.
All right, Zach, thank you. Great to have you here. Diane, welcome in. Tell folks who don't know where you are and who you're supporting, and then what's on your mind, please.
I'm from Iowa. I am supporting Trump, and I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about this RFK and the surrogate situation. But before I would mention that, he does talk about how one way to reduce the spending is by dealing with these chronic diseases, which is a very, very expensive thing. And that's probably the only way to reduce Medicare spending without cutting Medicare. So it's kind of an interesting way to, look at that. Obviously, there would be some initial policies that would need to be implemented. But what I really was thinking about is this RFK message is seeming to really pick up. And obviously, I'm probably getting this algorithm, so it's probably just showing me more of it too. But then, people are really interested in this Elon Musk potential role in the government for efficiency. And it reminds me a lot of in 2016, how the list of Supreme Court justices really kind of pushed the evangelicals to support Trump, even though he wasn't really attractive to them otherwise in a lot of ways. Do you think that these surrogates are more effective than you typically see, or am I just a little bit over-inspired?
Yeah, you talking specifically about Bobby Kennedy?
Bobby Kennedy and even Elon Musk has some people who have a lot of following interest in him.
Yeah. They're definitely unusual surrogates, and the Kennedy name and Musk's celebrity, they're unusual. They can build a crowd. Musk is also spending a lot to try to help Trump win. So I would say back of the envelope, they are more effective surrogates than your norm. because they can build a crowd, and that's a lot of what surrogates do to get people to come to events and get them to register to vote or to cast ballots. But in terms of sort of individually persuading people individually, I'm not so sure about Musk. Kennedy maybe, because of some of the issues, as you pointed out, some of the signature issues he has, I think, have the potential to attract people to Trump who otherwise might not support Trump. Thank you, Diane, for coming back. Ben, welcome in. Glad to have you. Tell folks who don't know where you are, who you're supporting, what's on your mind.
Northern Virginia, supporting neither candidate. I had a few questions for Zach. A lot of the most recent elections in the Western world have seen massive party shifts. You had the Labour takeover in the UK. The French are kind of all over the place. Germany, similar situation. I think to your point on economic lags, a lot of the changes in power are associated with these economic lags, right? There's an anomalous economic situation. The Labor Party takes advantage of it and says we can fix this situation. But as soon as Stammer takes over, his approval ratings are in the trash because he can't, provide oil subsidies, right? So I'm curious, do you think that the comfort level with re-nominating Trump as the Republican candidate has something to do with pre-COVID economic conditions and a condition in the human condition of a comfort level that the national conversation was comfortable with, sans all of his craziness, right? So everybody's comfortable with the economy. That's the same reason they gave Labor, the Blair, era was good. It's kind of like going back to good feelings, regardless of whether or not there's actual policy proposals that would indicate strong economic advances.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. And I suppose this could be perceived as a partisan thing, but I don't mean it that way. That many people who support Trump look back at 2016 until COVID hit, until March of 2020, because after that, it's not fair to judge his economic record in the face of that particular crisis. As he may have talked crazy, but he didn't really do anything crazy fundamentally, right?
Right.
And by crazy, I just mean very few people think that Trump is a particularly balanced person in his rhetoric. I mean, he's not, and I don't think he would say he is. And at the end of the day, actions matter a lot more than words. The amount of people that are going to be affected by Trump if he was going to go on a pogrom against his enemies is in the dozens or hundreds in a country of 340 million people, i.e. most people. It will not, matter to most people, and most people don't care. They're all like, "Look, you guys play dirty in your own sandbox, and as long as I've got a job in healthcare."
Right.
And I think what's really interesting about the example you use globally is what you've actually had is an incredibly set of very, very close and divided and non-mandate elections. So yeah, the Tories lost hugely in the UK, but the Labour Party got 37% of the vote. I mean, it's the way that thing worked. Modi, lost in India relative to their saying that they're going to sweep, but he still became prime minister. And a lot of that was on economic grounds. I mean, it was his own poor economic base in northern India that rejected the BJP. Milei in Argentina, doesn't really have a mandate. He's trying to do what he's doing. The French, as you just said, are completely divided. The Germans. You have a lot of countries where there's sort of no real consensus. And certainly whatever happens in the United States will be an example of that as well. I mean, neither of these candidates are getting more than 50% of the vote at most, and there's no way Trump's getting 50%. I mean, Trump could win, but he won't get 50% of the vote. So
I think it could easily be the situation where whoever wins, we end up in the exact same situation where Labor is now, where 5 months in, they're dealing with headwinds because people are just looking for something to grab onto until the ebb of the economic uncertainty kind of stabilizes, and globally there is some consensus as to where the markets are going, where the economy is going. And it just seems to me like the Trump reaction was more a matter of grabbing onto something, the last thing that felt good versus the future.
And just one more thing on this. The last person mentioned Elon Musk coming in, with his innovation / I'm going to make the government more efficient. The last person who did that was Al Gore. Well, actually, Obama did that with Cass Sunstein. So there's been a whole, every 8 year we wake up and we realize we have a completely unwieldy bureaucracy that should be more efficient. The problem is we have a lot of laws and regulations that make it almost impossible to change that. So you could not staff the government. You could try to fire people. You could try to not enforce regulations. And then we also have a court system. So what you could have is a lot of chaos, but it's not clear that you could easily have a lot of change.
I will say the last thing, and then I'll let Mark get back to it. But the change in the regulatory structure based on the Supreme Court case, the Chevron case, will be interesting for me from a policy wonk perspective. How does the government deal with regulations post Chevron? Because that's a big deal that people aren't talking about.
It's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. And, it is not true as the left and liberals have said that this means that at the end of the regulatory state, it means the rise of the judicial oversight of the regulatory state.
Somebody has to take responsibility.
So,
Ben, tell folks why you don't have a candidate.
I don't have a candidate because I am a center-right guy who doesn't support somebody who doesn't understand policy. So Donald Trump is a vehicle for a lot of people to express frustrations, but he doesn't have economic policies. I don't support the Harris policies. I don't think that giving people $50,000 for a house or, a small amount of money for a startup to start up a business on a tax credit, those things don't make sense to me. Nobody has come with a very clear litany of economic policies. Much to Zach's point, it's far easier to list things than to go into these very detailed, nuanced things that aren't going to happen. And also the Harris plan doesn't take into account the fact that the Senate is largely pretty much already gone, if not, going to be very close. And so I can't vote for somebody who doesn't have a real policy agenda. The last person to have a real policy agenda was, Paul Ryan, who is running Fox from the boardroom. And so.
All right, Ben, thank you, man. Thank you for joining. Appreciate it. Come back regularly. My friend Ray from Ohio. Ray, welcome in. Ray is a journalist and a genius and a great member of Two Way. What's on your mind, my friends?
Well, I have a different question for you. It actually kind of dovetails into something Ben just mentioned. I'm wondering about your read for the House and the Senate, because I personally don't care whether or not Biden, excuse me, God, none of us want Biden. I personally don't care if Trump or Harris is in the White House, provided that we do not have single party control, which is where I sadly right now project that this is heading, with the Republicans winning the White House, the House, and the Senate. But anyway, I'm interested in your take on where we might be heading.
The House is going to be unprojectable by anybody because we got 26 races. It's unlikely to get much bigger or much smaller. The spending numbers are a little confusing. Democrats have more. And if you look at where the races are, some in battleground states, but as you know, a lot in blue states too. So I still think the only logical position to take on the House is that it's much more likely to go to the presidential winner than not. But that's not a sure thing. And no one should be surprised if the House majority is not the winner of the presidential. It's more likely that it will be, but no one should be surprised if it's not. And you pour over the 26 races, and it's very hard to move them. They're toss-ups for a reason, and I don't see in the last month much movement there to push any of that a toss-up. So you look at the House Republican majority, the Delta now, you look at the number 26, in all likelihood, it's a small majority for the presidential winner, or a small majority for the losing presidential party. The Senate's interesting. If Tricia came on last night and was very bearish on the Republicans' chances. I've moved more bullish on their chances. I think, if you assume Montana's gone, which I don't, but most people do, then that means Republicans have to win only one more, even if they lose the White House. Senate races tend to make their own wind and weather. But we do have an aberrational cycle because you've got so many contested Senate races in presidential battleground states. So I continue to divide them, Ohio and Montana together. I still think that Republicans could lose Ohio, but set those two aside. You've got three strong Republican Senate candidates two facing incumbents in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and then one open seat with Mike Rogers against Slotkin in Michigan. I think right now, I'd be surprised if Republicans didn't win at least one of those, maybe two, maybe all three. And then you've got Maryland, which I looked possible for Republicans, looking less so. And then you've got the two Western ones. So could Democrats hold all 10 races where they've got seats that are problematic? Suppose they could, but I think chances are, even if Harris wins, that they'll lose some number. So Republicans will have the majority. Now, the Nebraska race is still close, and Republicans are definitely worried about it. I don't think either Florida or Texas will be blowouts, but I also don't think the Republicans will lose those races. So the question is, can Democrats hold all but one more besides West Virginia and win Nebraska? Suppose so, but it doesn't seem that way. And the movement has been towards the Republicans. In public and private polling, the movement has been Wisconsin most pronounced. You've seen a race that was not competitive that's now clearly competitive, even though he's not a very strong candidate. So I would say right now that it'd be very difficult to see Kamala Harris having unified control, but not impossible. People should not say that's impossible. Trump unified control is more likely, but again, not a sure thing, because I don't know that he'll win the House. That's as good as I can do. And if you find, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, Mark. I was going to say, for those that don't know, I'm in Ohio, and I would be very surprised if Bernie Moreno, the Republican candidate, won.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, but as you know, we're in the minority. Any analyst who tells you with more certainty than I just did about what's going to happen in the House and Senate, I wouldn't believe them, because I don't think it's more knowable than I just laid out. That's my view. Ray, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, let's go to John. John, come on in. Tell folks where you are, who you're supporting for president, and what's on your mind, please.
I'm in California. I'll be voting for Trump. My first political experience was with Robert Kennedy. I've shifted because the party has shifted underneath me.
On what issues, John, has it shifted?
I'm particularly interested in free speech as an example, and what I would characterize as the more sensible and effective international policy and a better set of domestic policies. So it's a broad conversation. But
are you a fan? I'm sorry, but are you a fan of Trump, or you're voting for Trump because you just don't like the Democrats?
I'm voting for Trump because I don't like the Democrats, and I thought he was much more effective in his first presidency than Obama was or Biden was.
Okay, last question. Did you vote for Trump in 16 and or 20?
Yes, and yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Question is about possible continued violence in the political system if Trump wins. And we saw in 2020 lots of violence, and then boarded up cities before the election, and the boarding came down after Trump won. And this is part of an economic question and part of just a political process question. But I sort of think societies are pretty fragile, and we've effectively normalized violence, particularly on the left. So I could imagine months of violence, and that I hope that doesn't happen. But I think it's a plausible scenario to examine. And you, Mark, have observed that if Trump wins, Democrats will find a hard time accepting that. So that's the question. What happens if we have extended political violence?
John, what violence are you referring to that we've seen?
We had the mostly peaceful demonstrations in 2020 after George Floyd. We've now had after October 7th protestations. We've had a long history on campuses of canceling of speeches. We've had shutting down roadways. So we've had a low level of political violence, and then some acceleration in 2020. I think we could have an acceleration again.
Yeah. John, what do you think about the violence associated with January 6th?
I think that was an extraordinary event. What was very different is we've had also an extraordinary event to punish those involved. And on the others, we've had virtually none. If you look at those who protested post October 7th, very little consequences.
I'm gonna press you a little bit, John, because you used the word extraordinary. That's like, if you'll pardon the expression, a little weaselly. Was it extraordinarily bad, or just a spectacle?
It was extraordinarily bad. It was real riot.
Okay, just making sure. Just making sure. Look, I don't think it's predictable. I think that I wonder how the winner will behave towards the 50% of the country who's very disappointed in the outcome. I really do wonder how they'll behave. And I think that one of the things I'm most disappointed in about President Biden was I think he did virtually nothing to try to actually bring the people who didn't vote for him onto his side. I would say if you have a checklist of the things he did to alienate them versus the things he did to bring them in, I don't think he did a very good job, despite his professed commitment to bring the country together. I don't know what what the winner will do. I think if the loser concedes gracefully and the winner reaches out to the other side genuinely, not just, putting a token Republican in the cabinet or whatever. And of course, if there is divided government, the loser will have to reach out, at least legislatively. I think if that all happens, I'm hopeful that there won't be a lot of violence. But that's a lot of ifs, and that also includes a clean election outcome. I would like to see governors, and I'm always pushing these kinds of things back on governors. I would like to see every governor have a plan to deal with that in a way that protects First Amendment rights, but limits the damage to property, loss of life, and also tries to talk to people to try to diffuse whatever is making people so unhappy that they want to engage in violence. I think that's much better done by governors than to think that Washington should try to figure that out. So I hope that every governor in the country, and if it were me and I was the governor of a state and I was a Republican, I'd call a former governor of the state who was a Democrat and vice versa. And I'd say, I need you to be my partner. And I'd call civic leaders and business leaders and religious leaders and labor leaders. And I'd form basically an anti-violence task force that was ready for it to diffuse it. Because the vast majority of people in every state would not like to see political violence, whatever the motivation. But it's the failure to plan for it, because we could have a cascade of events that's the exact opposite of what I'm hoping happens. And then we could have a lot of violence. And I think it'd be super unfortunate. But I'd like to see the government think this through in advance. Zach, do you have views on this?
I think this issue of political violence is hysterically overblown by both the left and the right. And John, you've lived through periods of American history that have been unequivocally way more violent. I mean, the 60s and 70s had a level of political violence that dwarfs anything going on today. The protests that went on after October 7th on a handful of the 3,000 campuses in the United States, almost all of which were either in the Northeast, a few in California. The vast majority of campuses did not see any political violence around October 7th. Ohio State, Penn State, University of Michigan, well, not University of Michigan, Michigan State, Florida State, like none of these places had an issue. This was largely confined to elite, often Ivy education institutions, and were worse than they had been since the 1980s. So there was a lot of violence around protests around apartheid. People were camping out of campuses. They were shutting down classes. There were unionization efforts in the 80s from clerical and custodial workers at universities. I just think that because we see all these things viscerally, either on TV or the internet, it creates an optic of a level of violence that is disproportionate level to the level of violence it actually is. And that the United States has historically been a pretty violent society, except for the past 20 years, which have been somewhat anomalous. Then you had COVID, you had a really divisive 2020 election, and you had people on the streets. But the level of actual violence, I think, is vastly overblown. And statistically, I mean, that is backed up.
All right. Vin Weber, former congressman from Minnesota, from a state that saw its share of violence in 2020, and who is second to only me and the late Bob Dole in belief in the power of the 10th Amendment, joins us. Congressman, what's on your mind?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was going to talk about the economy, but I have to say, after what I saw in Minneapolis, violence in the streets is a very big concern of mine, and I think it may happen after this next election. But what I really want to talk, I wanted to get back to our budgetary discussion, because even though we've never met, I have followed Zach Karabell for many years, and I'm a great admirer, and it's a real honor to be on with you. I got a couple of questions about the budget, though, that I just wanted. First of all, we talked a lot about
Vin, hold on, Vin, hold on one second. John, we're very grateful to you for coming on and asking your question, and we hope you come back soon. Okay.
John's a great American.
Yes, John, thank you. Go ahead, Vin.
We talked a little bit about efficiency in government and Elon Musk and things like that. And my mind went back to the Grace Commission when I was in Congress and intermittent efforts in between. And one of the things that, I know Trump has talked about this as a budget cutting thing. One of the things that has struck me over the years is that efficiency in government, although it's highly desirable, is not really a budgetary issue. We are not going to change the budget through efficiencies in government. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it, because we want the delivery of services to be the best they can, and because wasting money is just sort of an inherent bad thing. But I don't think that it's a budgetary issue. That's particularly today with the percentage of our budget that's tied up in entitlement programs and things like that. We have to make, if we really want to change the budgetary situation of the country, we have to make difficult decisions about taxes and entitlement spending. And the notion that we're going to eliminate the deficit or even make a dent in it by getting greater efficiencies in government is very misleading to people. I would like to know your thoughts on that, Zach. And then the second thing I would simply say is, in terms of the size of the deficit, the Republican view is, in my view, and my view has always been, what the major thing, if we're not going to be able to contain our spending and deficits, the most important thing is that we maintain the maximum possible growth rate for the American economy. And that's kind of simplistic in my view, but households can borrow money as long as they keep earning money. Businesses can assume debt as long as they keep increasing earnings. The country's not much different than that. And so policies that may seek to reduce the debt, and I guess I get partisan here, like massive tax increases on corporations and investing individuals and others, are damaging, not so much because the taxes themselves are damaging, but because they reduce economic growth, which is essential to maintaining our ability to sustain the debts. Right or wrong, Zach?
First of all, Congressman, you were a great, in many ways, bipartisan, work across the aisle congressman in the 1980s. For those of you who don't know, look up Vin Weber, you can see it.
Thank you,
which is in short supply in the House today, although I think it still exists in the Senate. It exists in the House too. We just don't pay attention to it publicly because it doesn't get headlines. So I know we have a moment, Mark. I think the reality is you're totally right on the efficiency thing. You know better than all of us here combined that if a department that Congress has allocated money to doesn't spend the money remains allocated. So right. It doesn't matter if Trump comes in and Elon comes in and says we're not going to hire 5,000 people unless Congress cuts the budget. Those jobs are funded, and they show up as funded, and they show up as money spent, even if it isn't spent, which is a whole other issue. But everyone should be aware of that, right? We live in a weird world of politics, and no matter what wand you wave, it doesn't change that. The tax question, like I live in a really high tax state, and I pay a lot of taxes. And my attitude has been, I'm happy to pay taxes if government does something constructive with the money. I'm not happy to pay taxes if government wastes the money. Now, one person's constructiveness is another person's waste, so there's a bit of an art, not always a science. But the reality is, I don't think the issue is how much taxes we collect. I think it's what we spend the money on. And I'm not sure you would fully disagree with that. You would probably say, look, government can never spend money well. It just can't, and we shouldn't expect it to. And therefore, it should spend less and tax less. And that's probably a fair, realistic argument. I just think there are needs that human beings expect from their government in terms of foreign policy security, some degree of domestic order, and some degree of caring for those who cannot otherwise care for themselves, elderly children, healthcare, you name it. And that, that stuff we should pay taxes for, the commons, but we should demand the government do it well.
By the way, quickly, I agree with that. The only thing I would add is I'm an old line supply sider. The way in which we levy the taxes matters to me. If we levy taxes in a way that has a negative effect on investment and savings and work, that's a bad thing.
All right. grateful to have you two and delighted to have you connected. Ben, thank you as always for participating. Thanks to Ray and John and everybody else who were part of it. Very glad to have Zach here, and Zach, hope you'll be back on a regular basis, particularly as when we get a new president, we have to actually figure out what they're going to do. So grateful to Zach for coming in. Zach, thank you. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Eastern time, Sean and Dan and I will be here. There are more campaign events tonight, for one thing, and I think there's some more polls about to drop, I believe, and I'll have some more reporting on a bunch of stuff. So grateful to everybody for making time. We'll see you 9 a.m. tomorrow, and then I'll be back at 6 for two-way tonight in 23 hours. So have a great evening. We'll see you early tomorrow morning and then again tomorrow night. Thank you.